Karen Thompson had always been a woman full of energy and curiosity. Growing up in a small town in Ohio, she spent most of her childhood dreaming about faraway places, castles, palaces, bustling cities, and rich histories that seemed like something out of a storybook. For years, she saved every penny from her job at the local bakery to make her dream of traveling abroad come true. Finally, at 32 years old, Karen found herself standing on the cobblestone streets of London, her heart racing with excitement. This was it, the trip she had waited for her entire life. London was everything Karen imagined and more. The city buzzed with life, its streets filled with people from all over the world. She wandered through famous landmarks, snapping photos and soaking in the atmosphere. Each corner of the city felt magical, but there was one place she couldn't wait to see: Buckingham Palace. As someone who loved history and tradition, Karen was fascinated by the idea of seeing the Queen's royal guards up close. She had seen pictures of them online, their striking red uniforms, tall bearskin hats, and perfectly polished boots. They looked like characters straight out of a movie. On the morning of her visit, Karen woke up early, eager to beat the crowds. She dressed casually but made sure to bring her camera, ready to capture every moment. When she arrived at the palace gates, she joined a group of tourists waiting patiently to catch a glimpse of the iconic changing of the guard ceremony. The air was alive with anticipation as visitors pointed excitedly at the guards standing motionless in their posts. Karen stood quietly, observing the scene before her. The guards were impressive, their posture rigid and unwavering despite the constant chatter and clicking cameras around them. Some tourists tried to get their attention by waving or making funny faces, but the guards didn't budge. It was almost surreal how still they remained, like living statues guarding centuries of tradition. Karen watched as a child blew bubbles near one of the guards, only for the bubbles to float past him without eliciting even the slightest reaction. Another tourist pretended to sneeze loudly right next to a guard, hoping to startle him, but again, nothing happened. As Karen stood there, an idea began forming in her mind. What if she could be the one to finally break their composure? Surely, a little harmless prank wouldn't hurt anyone, right? Her thoughts drifted back to the pepper spray sitting in her purse, a small canister she carried everywhere out of habit. Back home, it gave her peace of mind when walking alone at night. But now, as she glanced between the guard and the canister, a mischievous thought crossed her mind. Maybe just a quick spritz into the air would do the trick. Wouldn't it be funny to see the guard flinch? Karen hesitated for a moment, feeling a flicker of doubt. Was this really a good idea? She shook off the thought, convincing herself that it was all in good fun. After all, what harm could a tiny puff of pepper spray possibly cause? With a mix of nerves and excitement, she reached into her bag, her fingers closing around the cold metal of the canister. Little did she know, her decision would lead to consequences far greater than she ever anticipated. As Karen gripped the small canister of pepper spray in her hand, her heart began to race. She glanced around nervously, half expecting someone to stop her or call her out for what she was about to do. But no one seemed to notice. The crowd of tourists was busy snapping photos, chatting excitedly, or trying their own silly antics to get a reaction from the stoic guards. For a moment, Karen felt invisible, as if the world had paused just long enough for her to make her move. She looked up at the guard standing closest to her, a tall, broad-shouldered man whose face was completely expressionless. His eyes were fixed straight ahead, unwavering, as though he wasn't even aware of the sea of people surrounding him. To Karen, it almost felt like he wasn't human, but some kind of machine programmed to stand perfectly still. The thought amused her and gave her a strange sense of confidence. Surely, a little harmless prank wouldn't hurt anyone. It might even lighten the mood, she told herself. After all, weren't people always saying that laughter brought people together? Karen took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. She reminded herself that this was just a bit of fun, nothing serious. With one final glance around to ensure no one was watching, she raised the canister slightly, pointing it toward the guard's face. Her finger hovered over the trigger. trembling slightly. Just a quick puff, she thought. That's all it would take. A tiny burst of mist, and then she'd step back, laughing along with everyone else at the absurdity of it all. But as Karen pressed down on the trigger, something inside her hesitated. For a split second, doubt crept into her mind. Was this really okay? What if the guard got angry? Or worse, what if someone reported her? Before she could fully process these thoughts, it was too late. A small cloud of pepper spray shot out of the canister, dispersing into the air between her and the guard. At first, nothing happened. Karen held her breath, waiting for the guard to blink, cough, or maybe even crack a smile. Instead, his body stiffened, and his hand instinctively moved to cover his eyes. Then, without warning, he staggered backward, clearly struggling to breathe. Panic surged through Karen's chest as she realized the gravity of what she had done. This wasn't a joke anymore. It was real. The guard wasn't laughing. He was in distress. Tourists nearby immediately noticed the commotion. Some gasped, others shouted, and within seconds, chaos erupted. People began running in every direction, unsure of what was happening. Parents scooped up their children, while others frantically grabbed their belongings and fled the area. Alarms blared loudly, echoing through the palace grounds as security personnel rushed to the scene. Officers appeared seemingly out of nowhere, barking orders and ushering people away from the gates. Karen stood frozen, her hands shaking uncontrollably. The canister slipped from her grasp, clattering onto the ground as reality crashed over her like a tidal wave. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. She hadn't meant to hurt anyone, just to have a laugh. Now she was surrounded by shouting voices, flashing lights, and panicked faces. Her stomach churned with guilt and fear as she realized the enormity of her mistake. Before she could gather her thoughts, two security officers approached her, their expressions stern and unyielding. One of them gestured for her to step aside, while the other began questioning her sharply. "What did you do?" he demanded, his tone leaving no room for excuses. Karen stammered, tears welling up in her eyes as she tried to explain herself. I didn't mean to," she managed to choke out, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was just a joke." But the officers weren't interested in jokes. They quickly escorted her away from the scene, leaving behind a trail of confusion and disbelief among the remaining tourists. As Karen was led away, she caught glimpses of horrified faces staring back at her. Some whispered angrily, while others simply shook their heads in disbelief. In that moment, Karen knew her life would never be the same again. What had started as a lighthearted prank had spiraled into something far more serious. And now, she would have to face the consequences. The moment Karen was led away from the palace gates, her world felt like it had been turned upside down. The once exciting streets of London now seemed cold and alien, as if the city itself had turned its back on her. Her mind raced with panicked thoughts, replaying the scene over and over again in her head. She could still see the guard's face, the way he had staggered back, his hand flying to his eyes as the pepper spray hit him. That image haunted her, a stark reminder of how quickly things had spiraled out of control. As she sat in the back seat of a police car, her hands cuffed behind her back, Karen struggled to process what was happening. Just minutes earlier, she had been an ordinary tourist, eager to explore one of the most famous landmarks in the world. Now she was being treated like a criminal, her actions judged not just by the officers, but also by the dozens of strangers who had witnessed the chaos she caused. The weight of their stares lingered in her mind, making her feel smaller and more ashamed with each passing second. At the police station, the atmosphere was tense and sterile. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the room. Karen was ushered into a small interrogation room, where she sat alone at a metal table. The chair felt hard and unforgiving beneath her, a physical reflection of the guilt pressing down on her chest. She tried to steady her breathing, but her heart continued to pound wildly. Every sound, the clink of keys, the murmur of voices outside, The screech of chairs being moved felt amplified, as though the world was closing in around her. When the officers finally entered the room, their expressions were unreadable. One of them placed a file folder on the table and began asking questions. "What were you thinking?" he asked, his tone sharp and unyielding. Karen opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. How could she explain something she barely understood herself? She hadn't meant to hurt anyone. It had started as a silly idea, a fleeting impulse born out of curiosity and boredom. But now, faced with the reality of her actions, Karen realized how reckless and selfish she had been. The officers didn't seem interested in excuses. They informed her that she was being charged with public disorder and assaulting a member of the royal household, a title that sent a shiver down her spine. Assaulting a royal guard. The word sounded absurd, almost comical, but the gravity of the situation hit her like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just any job. These guards were symbols of tradition, discipline, and national pride. By targeting one of them, Karen had crossed a line she never intended to approach. Meanwhile, back at Buckingham Palace, the scene remained chaotic. Security teams worked quickly to restore order, calming frightened tourists and ensuring the safety of everyone present. Medical personnel tended to Corporal James Whittaker, the guard who had been sprayed. Though his symptoms were mild, irritated eyes, a burning sensation in his throat, and temporary difficulty breathing, the incident left him shaken. For years, he had trained to remain calm under pressure, to stand firm no matter what challenges arose. But this was something entirely different. He hadn't expected to be attacked while simply doing his duty. Word of the incident spread rapidly, both among the staff at the palace and beyond. Social media platforms lit up with videos and photos taken by bystanders, capturing the moment Karen pressed the trigger and the ensuing commotion. Comments poured in from people around the world, many expressing outrage at her behavior. Some called her reckless, others labeled her disrespectful, and a few even joked about the absurdity of the situation. But for Karen, there was nothing funny about it. As she sat in that cold interrogation room, she knew she had made a mistake that would follow her for the rest of her life. Hours passed before Karen was allowed to make a phone call. With trembling hands, she dialed her sister's number, hoping for some semblance of support. When her sister answered, Karen broke down in tears, struggling to explain what had happened. "I messed up," she sobbed. "I messed up so badly." Her sister listened quietly, offering words of comfort, but unable to hide the shock in her voice. No one had ever imagined Karen, usually so kind and thoughtful, getting into trouble like this. By the time the officers returned to inform her of the next steps, Karen felt utterly defeated. She was released on bail, pending further investigation, but the damage had already been done. News outlets picked up the story, turning her into an international headline overnight. Friends and family back home were bombarded with messages asking if they knew the woman who pepper-sprayed a royal guard. For Karen, the humiliation was overwhelming. She had gone from being an excited traveler exploring. When Karen finally returned to her small hotel room in London, she felt like a ghost of her former self. The vibrant energy that had fueled her excitement just hours earlier was gone, replaced by a heavy cloud of shame and regret. Sitting on the edge of her bed, she stared at the floor, replaying every detail of the day in her mind. She could still hear the alarms blaring, see the horrified faces of tourists, and feel the cold metal of the handcuffs around her wrists. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Her dream vacation, a chance to explore history, culture, and new experiences, had turned into a nightmare. The next morning, Karen woke up with a pounding headache and an overwhelming sense of dread. She scrolled through her phone nervously, dreading what she might find online. Sure enough, news outlets had already picked up the story. Headlines screamed things like, "Tourist assaults Royal Guard," and "American woman sparks chaos at Buckingham Palace." Photos of her being led away by police officers were plastered across social media, accompanied by comments ranging from angry to mocking. Some called her reckless. Others joked about her actions, turning them into memes. One post even suggested she should be banned from traveling altogether. Each click of her thumb brought another wave of humiliation crashing over her. Back home in Ohio, the news spread like wildfire. Friends, family, and coworkers were bombarded with questions about Karen. At first, they thought it was some kind of misunderstanding or exaggeration. Surely, their Karen wouldn't do something so outrageous, or so they hoped. But as more details emerged, disbelief gave way to disappointment. How could someone who had always been so warm and considerate make such a reckless decision? Her mother sat glued to the television, tears streaming down her face as reporters recounted the incident. Even her closest friends struggled to reconcile the Karen they knew with the image of a woman pepper spraying a royal guard. Overwhelmed by guilt, Karen decided she needed to take responsibility for her actions. She couldn't undo what had happened, but maybe, just maybe, she could begin to repair the damage. Sitting at the tiny desk in her hotel room, she opened her laptop and started drafting a public apology. It wasn't easy. Every word felt inadequate compared to the magnitude of her mistake. But she poured her heart into it, explaining that her actions had been impulsive and thoughtless, not malicious. She expressed deep remorse for disrespecting the royal guards and tarnishing the dignity of such a historic institution. When she finished, her hands trembled as she hit send, sharing the statement with journalists who had reached out to her. To Karen's surprise, her apology received mixed reactions. Some people appreciated her honesty and willingness to own up to her mistakes. Others dismissed it as too little, too late. Still, there were a few who encouraged her to go further, to reach out directly to Corporal James Whittaker, the guard she had affected most. Inspired by their words, Karen contacted the British Embassy, asking if they could facilitate a formal letter of apology to him. To her relief, they agreed to pass along her message. In her letter, Karen wrote openly about how ashamed she felt. She acknowledged the seriousness of her actions and admitted that she hadn't stopped to think about the impact they might have. She thanked Corporal Whittaker for his service and expressed hope that he was recovering well. Most importantly, she promised to learn from this experience and use it as motivation to become a better, more mindful person. As Karen waited anxiously for a response, she began reflecting on the broader implications of her actions. Traveling abroad wasn't just about sightseeing or ticking items off a bucket list. It was about respecting other cultures, traditions, and people. She realized now that her behavior had been selfish and immature, driven by a desire for attention rather than genuine curiosity. Determined to grow from the experience, she started researching ways to give back, to turn her misstep into something positive. Days later, Karen received a reply from Corporal Whittaker. His letter was measured and thoughtful, acknowledging the pain and frustration her actions had caused. He made it clear that what she had done was unacceptable, but also emphasized the importance of forgiveness and moving forward. Reading his words, Karen felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe this didn't have to define her forever. Maybe, just maybe, she could rebuild her reputation, not as the woman who pepper-sprayed a royal guard, but as someone committed to learning, growing, and making amends. For the first time since the incident, Karen allowed herself to believe that redemption was possible. The response from Corporal James Whittaker came as a surprise to Karen, not just because he had replied, but because of the tone of his letter. It wasn't angry or harsh as she had expected. Instead, it was calm and measured, filled with a quiet dignity that reflected the very tradition he represented. In his words, Corporal Whittaker acknowledged the gravity of what had happened and admitted that her actions had been deeply unsettling for him and his fellow guards. Yet he also expressed understanding that everyone makes mistakes and emphasized the importance of learning from them. His closing line struck Karen the most. "We are all human, and we all deserve a chance to grow." Reading those words, Karen felt a mix of emotions: relief, gratitude, and a renewed determination to make things right. For the first time since the incident, she allowed herself to believe that this moment of recklessness didn't have to define her forever. She could choose how to move forward, and she decided then and there that she would dedicate herself to turning this painful experience into something meaningful. Karen began by reaching out to local organizations in Ohio that focused on cultural education and global awareness. She volunteered her time to speak at schools, community centers, and travel groups, sharing her story openly and honestly. At first, it was difficult. Standing in front of an audience and recounting the embarrassing details of her mistake made her feel vulnerable. But as she spoke, she noticed something remarkable happening. People listened, not with judgment, but with curiosity. They asked questions about her journey, shared their own experiences of making poor decisions, and thanked her for being brave enough to talk about her misstep. Her talks became a blend of humor, humility, and heartfelt advice. She started each session by admitting that she had acted impulsively and without thinking, using her story as a cautionary tale about respecting boundaries and traditions when traveling abroad. "I thought I was being clever," she would say with a rueful smile. "But instead, I ended up learning one of the hardest lessons of my life." She encouraged listeners to approach new cultures with empathy and openness, reminding them that even small actions can have big consequences. Word of Karen's efforts began to spread beyond her hometown. A local journalist wrote a feature article about her transformation, highlighting how she had turned a shameful moment into an opportunity to educate others. The piece caught the attention of a national morning show, which invited Karen to share her story on live television. Though nervous, she accepted the invitation, knowing it was a chance to reach an even wider audience. On air, she spoke candidly about her regret, her apology to Corporal Whittaker, and her commitment to promoting responsible tourism. Her sincerity resonated with viewers, many of whom reached out to thank her for her honesty and courage. As months passed, Karen's reputation began to shift. No longer was she simply the woman who pepper-sprayed a royal guard. Instead, she became known as someone who had faced her mistakes head-on and used them as a catalyst for positive change. Teachers started incorporating her story into lessons about accountability and cultural sensitivity. Travel bloggers praised her for sparking important conversations about respecting local customs while abroad. Even some of the same people who had initially criticized her online began revisiting their opinions, acknowledging that true growth comes from owning your errors and striving to do better. Karen also took practical steps to ensure her future travels would be more mindful. Before visiting any new destination, she spent hours researching its history, etiquette, and cultural norms. She joined online forums where travelers discussed respectful ways to engage with local communities, and she made it a point to connect personally with residents during her trips, listening to their stories and learning directly from them. These efforts not only deepened her appreciation for the places she visited, but also helped rebuild her confidence as a traveler. One day, while scrolling through social media, Karen stumbled upon a comment thread discussing her story. Someone had posted a photo of Buckingham Palace with the caption, "Remember that tourist who messed up here." But instead of mocking her, several replies defended Karen, pointing out how she had worked hard to make amends and inspire others. One commenter wrote, "She messed up, sure, but look at how far she's come. That's what matters." Reading those words brought tears to Karen's eyes. It was proof that people were willing to forgive, and that second chances were possible if you worked hard enough for them. Though Karen still carried the weight of her mistake, it no longer felt like a burden holding her back. Instead, it had become a stepping stone toward becoming a better version of. A year had passed since the fateful day at Buckingham Palace, and Karen's life had transformed in ways she never could have imagined. What began as a moment of reckless impulsiveness had evolved into a journey of self-reflection, accountability, and growth. Yet, despite all her efforts to make amends, there was still one thing Karen felt she needed to do before she could truly move on: return to London. The idea terrified her. The thought of stepping foot near Buckingham Palace again made her stomach churn with anxiety. Would people recognize her? Would they judge her harshly, or worse, mock her for having the audacity to come back? But deep down, Karen knew this wasn't about seeking forgiveness from others. It was about finding closure for herself. She wanted to face the place where it all went wrong, not as the person she had been then, but as the person she had become. With permission from the British Embassy and careful coordination with authorities, Karen arranged her trip. This time, however, she wasn't coming as a tourist. A journalist agreed to document her journey, capturing her reflections along the way. Together, they hoped to tell a story of redemption, a reminder that even when we fall short, we have the power to rise again. On the morning of her visit, Karen stood outside Buckingham Palace once more, her heart pounding as memories flooded back. The grand gates looked exactly the same, but everything else felt different. Gone were the carefree excitement and curiosity that had defined her first visit. In their place was a profound sense of humility and reverence. As she walked slowly toward the entrance, cameras clicked nearby. Reporters and bystanders had gathered, curious to see how this chapter would unfold. What happened next took Karen by surprise. Instead of hostility or ridicule, she was met with quiet respect. Many people approached her, not to scold her, but to thank her for sharing her story. "You've taught us something important," one woman said softly. "We all make mistakes, but it's what you do after that matters." Another man shook her hand, telling her he admired her courage for returning. These small gestures of kindness brought tears to Karen's eyes. For so long, she had carried the weight of public judgment alone. But now, she realized she wasn't facing it alone anymore. The most emotional moment came when Karen was invited to meet Corporal James Whittaker in person. Arranged discreetly by the embassy, the meeting took place in a quiet room away from the crowds. When Karen entered, Corporal Whittaker rose from his seat, his tall frame towering over her. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Then, extending his hand, he greeted her warmly. "Miss Thompson," he said, his voice steady and calm. "It's good to finally meet you." Karen hesitated, overwhelmed by emotion. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward and shook his hand, her own trembling slightly. "Corporal Whittaker," she began, her voice breaking, "I can't begin to express how sorry I am for what I did. It was thoughtless, disrespectful, and completely unacceptable. I hope you know that I never intended to hurt you, or anyone." He nodded, listening intently. When she finished speaking, he replied, "Thank you for your apology. It takes strength to admit when you're wrong, and I believe you've shown real growth since then. We all make mistakes, but it's what we learn from them that defines us." Their conversation lasted nearly an hour, covering everything from his experience as a royal guard to her efforts to promote cultural awareness. By the end, Karen felt lighter, as though a heavy chain around her chest had finally loosened. Though their worlds couldn't have been more different, they shared a mutual understanding that humanity is built on moments of imperfection and the willingness to grow from them. As Karen left the palace grounds later that afternoon, she paused to look back one last time. The sun cast a golden glow over the iconic building, its beauty undiminished by the events of the past. For Karen, it was no longer a symbol of shame but of resilience. She had returned to the scene of her greatest regret, faced it head-on, and emerged stronger on the other side. And though she knew she would carry the lessons of this experience for the rest of her life, she also knew she was ready to let go of the guilt that had weighed her down for so long. Her journey wasn't perfect, and it certainly hadn't been easy, but standing there, under the vast London sky, Karen felt a quiet sense of peace. She had proven, to herself and to the world, that redemption wasn't just possible. It was within reach if you were brave enough to seek it. Karen's return to London became a story that captured the attention of people around the world. Media outlets picked up the narrative, framing it not as a tale of failure, but as one of redemption. Journalists highlighted how Karen had turned her embarrassing mistake into an opportunity to educate others and promote cultural sensitivity. Her meeting with Corporal James Whittaker was described as a powerful moment of reconciliation, a testament to the fact that even in the face of conflict, understanding and forgiveness could prevail. The documentary footage of Karen's trip aired on television and online platforms, drawing millions of viewers. It showed her walking through the streets of London, visiting landmarks and reflecting on her journey. But the most impactful scenes were those of her standing outside Buckingham Palace and later sitting across from Corporal Whittaker. The camera captured raw emotion, her nervousness as she approached the palace gates, her tears during their conversation, and finally, her quiet smile as they shook hands. Viewers were moved by her sincerity and the grace with which Corporal Whittaker responded to her apology. Social media buzzed with reactions to the documentary. Many praised Karen for her courage in confronting her past and using it as a platform for positive change. "She didn't run away from her mistake," one commenter wrote. "She faced it head-on and turned it into something meaningful." Others shared personal stories of regret and redemption, inspired by Karen's willingness to own up to her actions. Teachers began showing clips of the documentary in classrooms, using Karen's experience to spark discussions about accountability, empathy, and respect for different cultures. Back home in Ohio, Karen noticed a shift in how people interacted with her. Friends and family who had initially struggled to understand her actions now spoke openly about being proud of her transformation. Strangers approached her at local events, thanking her for sharing her story and encouraging her to keep going. Even some of the harshest critics from the days following the incident reached out to apologize for their initial judgments, admitting they hadn't realized the extent of her efforts to make amends. Encouraged by the overwhelmingly positive response, Karen decided to take her advocacy a step further. She partnered with travel organizations and educational institutions to create workshops focused on responsible tourism. These sessions taught participants how to approach new cultures with respect and mindfulness, emphasizing the importance of learning before visiting. Karen also collaborated with influencers in the travel community to produce content that celebrated cultural diversity while addressing common pitfalls travelers might encounter. One of the highlights of this new chapter came when Karen was invited to speak at a global travel conference. Standing on stage in front of hundreds of industry professionals, she recounted her journey, from the chaos at Buckingham Palace to her eventual redemption. Her speech was met with a standing ovation, and afterward, attendees lined up to thank her personally. Several travel companies even offered to sponsor her initiatives, providing resources to expand her reach. Despite all the progress, Karen remained grounded. She knew that no amount of praise or recognition could erase what had happened, nor should it. The incident would always be part of her story, a reminder of the consequences of impulsive behavior and the value of cultural respect. Yet she also understood that it had shaped her into someone stronger, wiser, and more compassionate. Instead of letting it define her negatively, she chose to let it fuel her mission to inspire others. As months turned into years, Karen's name became synonymous with lessons in accountability and growth. Travel blogs often cited her story as an example of how to handle mistakes abroad, while educators used her journey to teach students about resilience and second chances. Though she continued to travel, she did so with a newfound sense of purpose, always mindful of the impact her presence might have on the places she visited. Looking back, Karen realized that the hardest moments of her life had led her to her greatest achievements. By embracing vulnerability and committing herself to making things right, she had not only rebuilt her reputation, but also touched countless lives along the way. And while she knew she would never forget the day she pepper-sprayed a royal guard, she also knew it was just one chapter in a much larger story. One defined not by shame, but by redemption and hope. Karen's story became more than just a personal journey of redemption. It evolved into a universal lesson about humanity, accountability, and the power of second chances. Her transformation resonated deeply with people from all walks of life, transcending borders and cultures. What started as an embarrassing mistake at Buckingham Palace had turned into a movement that encouraged others to reflect on their own actions and strive for growth. As time went on, Karen continued to build upon the foundation she had laid. She wrote a book titled Lessons from London, Turning Mistakes into Meaning, which detailed her experiences in vivid detail. The book wasn't just about the incident itself, but also about the lessons she learned along the way, how to face shame, seek forgiveness, and use adversity as a stepping stone toward becoming a better person. It quickly climbed bestseller lists, praised for its honesty and relatability. Readers connected with Karen's vulnerability, finding comfort in the fact that even someone who made such a public blunder could rise above it. The success of the book opened doors for Karen to speak on even larger stages. She was invited to international conferences, schools, and community events, where she shared her message of resilience and cultural awareness. Her talks often ended with standing ovations, not because she portrayed herself as perfect, but because she embraced her imperfections and showed how they could lead to meaningful change. "We're all capable of messing up," she would say with a warm smile. "But we're also capable of learning, growing, and making things right." One of the most rewarding aspects of Karen's journey was seeing how her efforts inspired others to take action. A teacher in Texas reached out to thank her after using her story to start a classroom project on cultural sensitivity. Students researched different countries, created presentations, and even hosted a mini cultural fair to celebrate diversity. In Canada, a group of high school students organized a campaign called Travel with Respect, encouraging young travelers to educate themselves before visiting new places. Each email, letter, or message Karen received reminded her that her story was making a difference far beyond what she had imagined. Even Corporal James Whittaker followed Karen's progress from afar, occasionally sending notes of encouragement. Though their lives remained vastly different, they shared a bond rooted in mutual respect and understanding. When Karen was asked in an interview if she felt she had truly made amends, she replied, "I'll never forget what I did. And I don't think I should. But knowing that Corporal Whittaker accepted my apology, and seeing how he responded with grace, has given me peace. It's taught me that forgiveness is possible when you're willing to work for it." Years later, Karen stood once again outside Buckingham Palace, this time as a confident advocate rather than a remorseful tourist. She marveled at how much her perspective had changed since that fateful day. The grand gates no longer represented fear or regret. Instead, they symbolized resilience and hope. As she took a photo to commemorate the moment, she noticed a young couple nearby trying to capture a selfie. Smiling, she offered to take their picture for them. They thanked her warmly, unaware of who she was or the long road she had traveled to get here. In many ways, Karen's story came full circle. From the chaos of pepper spray to the calm of reconciliation, she had proven that mistakes don't have to define us. They can refine us. Her experience served as a reminder that every choice matters, whether big or small, and that respecting traditions and boundaries is essential when exploring the world. Today, Karen is celebrated not for her misstep, but for her determination to turn it into something positive. Her advocacy has touched countless lives, sparking conversations about responsible tourism and cultural empathy worldwide. And while she knows perfection is unattainable, she believes wholeheartedly in the pursuit of growth, a belief she carries with her wherever she goes. For Karen Thompson, the woman once known for pepper spraying a royal guard, life has become a testament to the idea that redemption isn't just possible, it's powerful. Through courage, humility, and unwavering effort, she transformed a moment of regret into a legacy of inspiration. And as she looks ahead to the future, she does so with gratitude, knowing that sometimes our greatest failures can lead to our most profound successes.